Hi, everyone. I hope this finds all of you so very well. I'm speaking to you from my studio in West Orange, New Jersey, and I could not be more delighted to have the pleasure of interviewing the remarkable Rebe Huntman, a memoirist, essayist, dancer, teacher, and poet whose work explores the profound intersection of feminism, world religions, and spirituality. Rebe's journey is one of reinvention, courage, and discovery, making her a true heroine of her own life and a role model for grief to healing and rebirth. At 19, she experienced the devastating loss of her mother from cancer, and 30 years later, still carrying that grief, she found herself drawn to Cuba's festival celebrating Our Lady of Charity, which symbolizes salvation and Cuban identity. Rebe's search for her mother unfolded into a powerful personal exploration, one that challenged her understanding of self, her past, and the spiritual divide between the living and the dead, and led to her deeply moving journey of loss, transformation, and connection, titled My Mother in Havana, a Memoir of Magic and Miracle, the story of a woman navigating loss, family tragedy, and dysfunction while striving to become the person she longs to be, a daughter, a mother, and a keeper of the stories passed down through generations. Rebe's journey is threefold: a physical, literal journey from Ohio to Cuba, a psychological quest for a connection with her lost mother and for healing from the grief of losing her mother at a young age, and a spiritual search for faith in Afro-Cuban religious tradition. I'm looking forward to talking with Rebe, who divides her time between Delaware, Ohio, and San Miguel de Allende, Mexico, about how she found her way through her grief and back to her mother, who she had lost 30 years earlier, the world of seance, sacrifice, pilgrimage, and dance, which led Rebe to her deceased mother and a larger version of herself, the gods, ghosts, and saints of Cuba she learned from on her journey, the value of pilgrimage, how the act of writing is an act of healing, and more for a fascinating interview that will surely bring an abundance of important healing insights about reinvention, courage, and growth, from grief to healing to rebirth. Hi there, and welcome to the Grief and Rebirth podcast. I'm your host, author and trauma survivor Irene Weinberg, here to encourage you wherever you are in your healing journey. In each episode, I chat with incredible grief and trauma specialists, healers, mediums, and celebs, as well as remarkable people who have inspiring healing stories to share. If you're looking for a podcast that's both uplifting and inspiring, you've found it. Let us help you find your joy in life. Hi, Rebe. A heartfelt welcome to Grief and Rebirth podcast.
Oh, Irene, what a lovely introduction. I'm so happy to be here and be able to discuss this with you.
I enjoyed your book. I read it as I was preparing for the interview. It's a beautiful book, and I'm always fascinated by the ghosts, the gods, the ghosts, the saints, how these things come through, because I've experienced some of this, and I find that what we get from the spiritual world is non-sectarian. I mean, we're all part of a collective, and there's so much wisdom, no matter where you turn, that can be gleaned to help people. So I can't wait to share your story, because I think it's going to help give people insights like crazy and help a lot of people. Because you went about it, people go around connecting with their deceased loved ones in different ways, and yours was a very circuitous route, but really fabulous. So let's talk about that. Let's begin by sharing your relationship with your mother with us. How did you initially react to losing her? What was your relationship with her like? How did that grief for her dramatically surface 30 years later?
Yeah. Thank you for that question to start us off on. I like to say, none of us have gotten into this world without a mother. The mother is a central figure in all of our lives, even though the texture and shape of that relationship can be so vastly different. Some of us know our mother, some of us never meet our mother, some of us are close, some of us are estranged. But no matter what, it's a very central relationship. And it was absolutely for me. My mother was my person. She was the person who was really most interested in everything that I did as a child and who held me. You know, in My Mother in Havana, one of the first scenes where I introduced my mother is through an episode that happened to us when I was 10 years old, and we were swimming. We were on vacation in Mexico, and we were swimming, and we got pulled out to sea, and we almost drowned. And, you know, we were obviously eventually saved, and saved by men who swam out for us, who were professional divers. But it was my mother who held me in those waters, and she never let go of me. You know, we were being pulled under, and then we come up for
Wow.
air and call for help. And for me, that's just such a central metaphor for the relationship that I felt with her, that she was the one person who would never, ever let me go, right? Who would hold on to me through thick and thin. And then I was 19, she died. And that wasn't part of the pact.
No, your safety net was your safety net kind of disappeared. There it went, right?
Right. And I was bereft. It felt, even though it was, you know, we'd seen it coming. My mother had been ill. She'd had surgery. She'd gone through chemotherapy. She'd gone through natural therapies. And yet there was this magical thinking in all of the family members that we were going to beat it, that death was not an option. And then, you know, it was. So I was bereft. I was a college sophomore. And very well-meaning people around me. They were good people, but they gave me what I've come to think of as not helpful advice, which was, you know, move on. Your mother's gone. Move on. You're here in college. You know, worry about your test next week. Make something of yourself, because you want to make your mother proud, right? And the way to do that is to keep moving. And I followed that advice. I'm a good student, and I followed that advice all too well. And for 30 years, I moved forward and I focused on my life and on making something in my life. And part of that making was pursuing a career in Latin dance and choreography, the very career that would take me to Cuba, where I would reconnect with my mother 30 years later. But in the meantime, it was a slog, and I didn't want to make people around me uncomfortable. I noticed right at 19, when I first lost my mother, people got uncomfortable talking about death or thinking about death or thinking that I would be uncomfortable if they brought up my mother. And so I didn't talk about her. And then on the verge of turning 50, I couldn't stop thinking about her. My grief surfaced in such a big and aching way and in a different way. Irene, it felt like it had something to do with the fact that I was almost 50. She had died when she was in her 50s. It had something to do with really yearning for a role model, which surprised me because I thought that by the time you're 50, you really know who you are in the world. And, you know, you'd be really self-possessed and feel like a real badass. And I didn't feel like any of those things. I felt
Because
like,
you had a void, you had a hole that had not been healed yet. It was like just sitting
yeah.
there, right?
I missed my mother, and I didn't really know how to connect with that or what to do with that because in my culture, growing up in the Midwest in the United States, I didn't have any role models for how to deal with a 50-year-old woman who misses her mother. How do you connect with that? How do you give yourself permission to make that a central part of your life, right? When you yourself are supposed to be, you know, all grown. And then the second was, well, where do you find role models for the kind of grown woman who you want to be? And both of those questions led me to Cuba. And it was, thank goodness that I had that career, developed that career as a Latin dancer and choreographer that had taken me to Cuba. And because of that, I knew that if I went back to Cuba, I might find the answers I was looking for, which was A, how do I connect with someone that I feel like I've lost and that I myself have let go of? And B, how do I find a role model for the kind of woman I want to be in the world? And I found those things amongst the spiritual mothers of Cuba and the Afro-Cuban spiritual traditions that keep the dead close. Rather than saying, move forward to make something of yourself, the Afro-Cuban traditions say the only way you can move forward and make something of yourself is by relying on the voices of those who have come before, our beloved ancestors who are whispering in our ears and guiding us and saying, no, 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 don't turn left there, turn right. And so absolutely opposite way of looking at grief and healing and living, and our relationship with the dead that I found in Cuba.
And it gave you a way to leave behind that lens that you had learned in the Midwest, and process your grief in a whole new way and view it through a new lens, right?
Yeah. So when people, I mean, I think one of the mysteries of the book, My Mother in Havana, A Memoir of Magic and Miracle, is that my mother is not from Havana and neither am I, right? But my mother had spent time in Havana, and I talk about that in the book. But neither of us are Cuban. And so you mentioned in the introduction, the beautiful introduction, this is a circuitous path. It wasn't linear. It didn't make sense on a logical, linear, apparent way. And yet it absolutely made sense in that I could not have found the answers I needed to find in my own country, or I don't know that I could have. They
Well,
were
we're in
they were
your culture in Cuba, and Cuba, not Cuba, in Ohio, your culture in Ohio, you just weren't exposed to a lot of mediums or anything like that. That was not a common thing, was it?
I mean, it's not nearly as common as it is in Cuba, certainly. And there are certainly a lot of eyebrows, raised. Like, there's people who believe in that kind of thing and then people who don't. And there's a lot of judgment, I feel, in my own culture and country. A lot of skepticism. The go-to attitude might be, well, that's cute that Rebe's off to talk with a medium, but she's really wasting her time, and how silly of her. And I'm not saying that everybody in my culture believes that way, but that might be the dominant view. And because of that, it makes it, you're almost tiptoeing around kind of apologetic.
Yeah, I
Whereas
understand.
you go to a place like Cuba, and it's the crazy thing there would be to not talk with the dead, right? The
So
my friend,
you went to an environment where you were very comfortable, that gave you safety and made you sane instead of having to defend
yes,
what you were doing all the
yes.
time, right? That feels. And who was this Madeline, who helped you speak to your mother from beyond the grave? Could you tell us? So that was your first experience, right? You found Madeline?
Well, it all kind of came together all at once. And again, thank you for the beautiful introduction, because the book, My Mother in Havana, it takes myself and through me, through my eyes, the reader, through a series of experiences that include pilgrimages to the Mother's Saints, and it includes seances and what they call spiritus, a misa, like a mass, a spiritus mass, and through Santeria initiations and all kinds of things. And one of them, and all of these came to me all at once, in a sense that once I started pulling at threads and what I wanted to do in Cuba and what I wanted to find in Cuba, all of these threads started unspooling all at once. And
Wow.
one of them was Madeline. And he is a spiritist who lives in a very, very small town in Cuba, very small but sacred town called El Cobre, Cuba. It's on the eastern side of the island. Um, and with about, I mean, maybe 11,000, inhabitants. And I had heard of him through an anthropologist friend of mine who had been to El Cobre, and she had told me that he was very well respected there as being the real deal. Someone who, since childhood, could commune with the dead, always saw the dead, would tell his mother, Mom, close the windows, there's dead people looking in on us. And she'd be like, what? Because she couldn't see them. But he's had this gift. And so again, coming from that kind of skeptical or not wanting to seem like, the ditzy girl who's going off to talk with a medium, I kind of downplayed my interest in meeting with him, but it was very much of an interest. And I very much wanted to see what would happen when I met with him, and I did. And we spent hours together one day with
Oh,
him.
I love the story in your book, by the way. I'm recommending it to people who are listening to this interview, because your whole experience with him was amazing.
It was amazing. And the prologue opens with me sitting with Madeline, and he asks me, what have you come for? And I tell him, come to talk with my mother. Can you help me? Right. And over the course of hours and hours, he helped me. He works with the spirit of an escaped slave, a cimarron.
Wow.
And he works through that spirit to communicate with the other side. And I don't want to give away, I hope, your listeners, and the reason why I don't want to give away a lot about what happened there is not that, I'm I'm trying to be coy, but I think that the story of it all and
It's
the
worth
telling of the
reading.
story, it's more than just a punchline,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah, absolutely. So let's go to the gods and the ghosts and the saints of Cuba because you learned from them too. So you want to share some of the things that you learned from them? What did they teach you?
Yeah. So what's really beautiful about these Afro-Cuban spiritual traditions, and the main one that I connected with was, or the main ones were Santeria and Spiritism. And so I encountered Spiritism through Madeline. Yeah, I asked to summon my mother's spirit. And then in Santeria, it's this beautiful religion, spiritual tradition that arose from the conflict and the meeting, the encounter between Yoruba enslaved people who were brought from West Africa to Cuba, and who brought with them their African gods, their gods and their goddesses. They had a very, very clear
Mm.
cosmology. But when they came to Cuba, the Catholics said, "Here are your new gods, right? Here are your new gods and your new saints." And in order to keep their own African gods alive, they looked at the Catholic saints and gods and said, okay, that one looks a lot like, right, that Our Lady of Charity, that Mother Mary figure looks a lot like our river goddess Oshun. And so we're going to look at Our Lady of Charity and pray to Our Lady of Charity, but we'll really be communing with
Pretty
Oshun,
smart.
right? So, because of that, there's this really beautiful tradition that's a real blending of Catholic saints and gods and African gods and saints. And there is this sense that the whole world is just alive and beating with, spiritual essence and with the gods who come. They're not just on some distant mountain observing us, right? But in Santeria, there are all these orishas or intermediary gods that we have daily experience
And
with.
they're around us all the time, right?
They're around us all the time and they're instructing us like the dead are. And
And it's coming through like in thoughts that we have and different things that,
yeah, and in our
oh,
very characteristics. So, for example, each one of us in Santeria, each one of us has a guardian orisha, a guardian god, who is there to instruct us and show us how to be, but how to be our best version of ourselves. So each of the orisha has their own flavor, right? And so you're chosen by that orisha because you also have that flavor.
oh wow, that's very interesting.
An example is, my guardian Orisha is Oshun, the fertility goddess. And I very much, if you knew me and you knew all of Oshun's characteristics, right? That she's, the goddess of love and fertility and beauty, and she's a dancer, and she's a real badass too. She's got a lot of different things. She's very much, my personality and hers are very much in sync, right? And so the
So,
idea,
Rebe, are you telling our audience that you're a badass?
yes, I found out I'm a badass after all, or that I aspire to be, and that sometimes I'm a badass, right? Sometimes Oshun is definitely a badass. But yeah, so they're there and they're there instructing us, and they're there and they're whispering to us, and they're showing us how to live our lives much as the ancestors are. And so one of the things that I really learned personally in Cuba and that I really wanted to share with my readers and my mother in Havana is this idea that yes, this world is beating and pulsing with all kinds of spirits that are available to us and that are, there to show us the way. And for me personally, as a woman, the idea of having not just one in this book, I find two spiritual mothers. One is Oshun, the West African river goddess, and the other is Our Lady of Charity, this incarnation of the Mother Mary, that on the surface couldn't seem more different, right? We think about the Mother Mary being a virgin and very modest and humble, and then Oshun is this very, loud and in your face, beautiful, just, fertility goddess. And so the way I had been raised, how can these two be one? And this was another thing where I had to leave my thinking and go to another way of thinking. I had been raised that a woman could be one thing or another thing,
Mm.
right? We could be smart or we could be popular. We could be, whatever. And there was usually a right answer as to which side of the or we should be on. But in Cuba And with the Orisha, it's this and idea. We can be modest and humble like Our Lady of Charity and, larger than life like Oshun simultaneously. And that was a real change point for me to think about identity in those kind of really large and capacious.
Well, it sounds to me like, and a lot of people, I think, see life in terms of black and white. You
Mhm.
have to be this or you have to be that. And the
Right.
truth is, there is so much color to each of us, and there's so many layers. So you kind of got permission to uncover your other layers,
Yes.
I would think, right?
Yes, which
Yeah.
also has to do with the question of grief too. I love that you said black and white, this black and white thinking. Someone's either gone or they're here. There's this in between where they're physically gone, but they're very much connected, right?
Absolutely. And it seems that, and it's the same thing where often ask people about joy, because you can be in grief, but you can still have joy. Life is not this black and white either or choice. That's beautiful. So, because of this, you became a larger version of yourself because you discovered all these, or gave yourself permission to have all these other layers of yourself. Would you agree with that?
I would agree with that. And I gave myself permission to be both a grieving daughter who missed her mother and sometimes felt like, a young girl and sometimes feels like a real badass. And, life is messy and life is complicated. And so to just embrace all of it.
Yes, that's beautiful. And in your book, you created it as a love letter. My Mother in Havana, a memoir of magic and miracle. You created it as a love letter, an invitation, a roadmap, and a tribute to mothers. So, what would you like to tell us about your book and about why you created it with those intentions? What does a person get from reading
Yeah.
the
So
book?
I think the book is exactly that. It's a love letter starting to my 19-year-old self, the young version of myself that was bereft at the loss of her mother and didn't know where to turn. And by extension, it's a love letter to any reader who feels in that same position of vulnerability, of loss, of not having the answer, of not knowing, where to go. It's a love letter to the 50-year-old version of myself who had the courage to go and find the answers and create that DIY pilgrimage, to Cuba to find those answers. And again, by extension, to the reader who wants to think about that as well. Who wants to think outside the box, right? Into these larger than life possibilities. It's a love letter to Cuba, a country that reached out inexplicably but very powerfully to mother me and to the mother saints of Cuba, who I very proudly introduce my readers to, right? Who have so much knowledge and wisdom to share with us about what it means to be human and what it means to live full and messy and beautiful and grieving and healing and joyous lives all at once.
It feels like an embrace. You read your book and it feels like an embrace. And you're not only embracing all the parts of you, but you're embracing all the possibilities for people. And in Cuba, I did not know anything about Cuba, but it feels like there's so much love. And they have not had an easy life there either. And there's so much love that they're transmitting to each other and to people to welcome you the way they did. So there's a story you talk about this woman named Aballonia, who also looks for her deceased biological mother and finds what you called her spiritual mother. And this connects with your search for your own mother. So can you talk to us about Aballonia?
Yes, I would love to. So, Our Lady of Charity is Cuba's patron saint, and I've already referred to her as an incarnation of the Mother Mary. But she is to Cubans what the Virgin of Guadalupe is in Mexico. She's this larger than life, really important patron saint of the island who has been accredited with all kinds of miracles. And one of those miracles, the beginning foundational stories, there's a young girl named Apollonia who in the early 1600s was an enslaved woman living in El Cobre. And she loses her mother, and she's so bereft and really disoriented in her grief. She's kind of having that magical thinking that I talked about earlier, where she decides to climb this hill where her mother used to work, thinking that when she reaches the summit, she'll she'll find her mother. And again, it's magical thinking her mother is gone, but she fully expects to find her mother at the top. And when she
But
gets,
in a way, it's magical thinking, but it connects with what you did because magically you went to Cuba, right? To find your
yeah,
mother.
yeah, but she gets to the top and her mother's not there, and she's so upset, and she falls to the ground and she beats her fists against the earth, and she cries out for her mother. And in that moment, Our Lady of Charity appears to her and says, I am your spiritual mother. Go down the hill and tell everyone in El Cobre I'm here to protect you and show you the way, but also the whole town. You'll be blessed, and et cetera, et cetera. And so Apollonia, instead, she climbs back down that hill, crying still, but from the joy of having found her spiritual root. And this is very much, when I first heard this story, this is a famous story in Cuba. It's very much, when you read about Our Lady of Charity and her stories, you'll read about Apollonia, but you don't always hear the version that I just told. In a lot of the versions, the mother is still alive when Apollonia goes to climb the hill and finds the spiritual mother. But this version of the story was told to me by a priest at her sanctuary. And the
Oh,
first time
wow.
I heard it, I just wept. I said, that's me. I'm Apollonia. This is what I've done. I've come to Cuba looking for my mother, Mimi Huntman, who I found, by the way, and I found ways to connect with her that are beautiful and that I'm so excited to be able to share with readers. But I also found the spiritual root, right? So both the spiritual mother and a way back to my biological mother.
Would you like to share with us any of the ways that you found that your mother's now connecting with you or that
Yeah.
you found to connect with her? I think it would be very helpful for our listeners.
Yeah. So it's interesting. Again, in the book, in My Mother in Havana, I go through all these different experiences and the initiations into Santeria and the pilgrimages. And there's a lot of big thinking and a lot that I share that's really, wonderful. But the condensed version of it, right? The like, if you were only going to do one thing kind of version, it's just giving yourself permission to talk with your lost beloved.
Mm.
And in Cuba, and in not just in Cuba, in many parts of the world, the ancestral altar is such a prominent feature of the home, right? And we don't, at least in my upbringing in the Midwest in the US, it's not common. But the idea of setting aside a space in the home for everyday communion with the lost beloveds is so beautiful.
It's
In the
beautiful.
Yoruba tradition, they used to bury the dead beneath the floorboards of the house. And because the understanding is they're there guiding and whispering to you. So, of course, you want them as close as possible so you can hear those voices. So, we don't do that anymore, but we can put out a picture. So, I've got a very elaborate ancestral altar. In my case, it's not just my mother, it's my mother and my father and my grandparents and my great grandparents and my stepmother, my husband's parents. It's all of our shared dead. And I have pictures of everybody I've got a picture of. And of course, my mother is right there in the middle and a really big, beautiful.
Beautiful.
But it's this normalizing of things because I've got them, my ancestral altar is right in my writing attic where I write. So every morning when I come up my attic, the first thing I see are their faces. And so the very act
Beautiful.
of just saying, hey, hello there. I see you. Thank you for bringing me into the world. Thank you for guiding and protecting me. Thank you. So it starts out with gratitude. And then multiple times during the day, I can just be like, hey, I see you.
And they hear you. And they hear
Sometimes,
you.
sometimes it'll be more elaborate. Sometimes I'll make dinner and bring it up here and we'll eat together, right? I'll eat and then I'll leave a plate for them to finish. A friend of mine, told me once she also really works with the spirits, West African spirits. And she said, Rebe, if you have a problem that's really, really tough and really bothering you, you can sleep before the ancestral altar and just ask that through your dreams the answers be revealed. There's all these ways to just normalize the communication and just make it part of every day. My stepmother, after my father died, used to take his photograph in a frame and dance with him every
Oh,
day in the house because they danced when he was alive. And so she
beautiful.
continued that tradition. So that for me is the most healing thing, is just opening up that channel of communication.
That's beautiful. And knowing that they hear you and knowing that they can respond in their way, but with different messages that you get. And my passion is to tell people to heal, because the more you heal and remove the blockages, the better you can hear them.
Yes,
The better
absolutely.
you can hear them. Now, you recommend writing as a healing tool for people. So tell our listeners why, if they're grieving or they're struggling, that it can be helpful to them. How did you discover that?
Well, I think that I've discovered it by being a writer who has also been grieving and healing for a number of decades. And I think I separate my advice out into two different pies. I think there's one advice for a person who is just at the beginning stages of grief. And this is the advice I wish I could reach back into time and give my 19-year-old self, which is write everything you remember about the person, right? Like write down, I've lost so much with time. I know my mother wore a red lipstick, but I can't tell you the name of it. I know she had a favorite perfume. I can't remember the name of it. I know she told fabulous stories, but I can't recount one of them. So I wish I had just cataloged everything. And that requires it would have required of me a willingness to sit with the messiness of the grief, to cry as I was writing, and to write nonsense in the sense that it wouldn't have been writing for anybody else. It wouldn't be writing that's meant to be art or to help somebody else heal, because that's not where I was at. I just needed a place to grieve and to catalog. And I wish I had those notes now, and I don't. So that's my advice for, I think sometimes when people are first grieving, they want to write something that'll help the world or be some form of, art or something for others. And I don't think that's the purpose at the beginning. I think that you come to a point, and for me, it was 30 years after my mother died, maybe it doesn't have to be that long, where now you've got some enough distance that you can make art. And by art, I just mean you can ask some interesting questions and important questions beyond just, I miss my mother, right? In the beginning, it's, I miss my mother, I miss my mother, I miss my mother. And then later, it's, why do I miss my mother? What is the mother? If I've all but lost the texture of her, what am I missing and how can I find it? And when you're getting scratching at some of those big questions and in a place where you're no longer just at the top of the hill like Apollonia beating your fists against the earth, I think that's when you can really, writing My Mother in Havana was a very transformative experience for me because it allowed me, I spent 10 years working on it. It allowed me 10 years to sit with these really messy, beautiful, big questions and find some answers to share with others.
That's beautiful. And thinking of messy, beautiful question, you also had family tragedy and dysfunction that you healed through this. Did I
I
get that correctly? That in addition to healing from the loss of your mother, there was some family tragedy and dysfunction that you also got to heal?
Well, I'm not sure what you're referring to, but I would absolutely say yes. So whether or not we're talking about the same thing, what comes to my mind is,
I mean, from your childhood, were there things
yeah,
that happened that also enabled you to heal those pieces that were also kind of sticking out as
yeah,
not addressed?
absolutely. Absolutely. Because part of writing My Mother in Havana was healing myself and finding answers about my own grief. But part of it was really wanting to give both my mother and me a do-over. And by that, I mean my mother had lived, she was a very larger than life woman who lived a very small life. And had to sacrifice a lot of those really big, beautiful, magical parts of herself in order to be my father's wife and our mother. And I felt that for myself growing up in again the culture that I grew up in, I was taught to play very small, right, as a woman and as a young woman growing up when I was. And lots of ors. You can be this or you can be that, but don't ask for too much and don't want to,
Black and white, black and white,
right?
black and white.
Um, and so much, I mean, it was very toxic. Like, well, boys won't like you if you're too much. And
I got the same messages, by the way, Rebe.
well, lots of women do, and even if they're not spoken out loud, they're there in the air, those messages that are so toxic. And so what's really beautiful about the experience I had in Cuba and then the writing of this book and the sharing that I do about Our Lady of Charity and Oshun and the messages I got about permission to live larger than life, that was this secondary healing that feels really profound and very much in tandem with the healing over the grief. So thank you for that question. Absolutely.
Yeah, I really, well, in my own experiences, I've healed the grief over from the accident, losing my, my husband, I call it transitioning and moving on and all of that. But there have been so many other pieces
Hmm.
within myself that are also healing. So that I know that when people heal, begin to go through the process of healing their grief, it often brings up more and gives you an opportunity to look at that. My next question is, because my passion is about healing, and your book is so much about healing your grief and learning from it, moving on. If healing grief offers us the opportunity to keep the dead close, which a
Hmm.
lot of cultures don't know, but which is what you learn, and how does it act as an invitation to create space and rituals in our lives that also help? Because you learn to create rituals in your life, right? Which also keeps your mom close to you. So, can you talk to us about that? Because a lot of people, like you say, a lot of people, the person dies and they think, move on, move on, move on. But now you're keeping, how are you keeping your mom close through different rituals that
Yeah.
you learned?
Yeah, so again, the main one is the most mundane of all that I've already spoken about is just creating physical space for that person to occupy, right, in the house through the ancestral altar, through an invitation to speak. Sometimes I'll be at a restaurant that reminds me of a restaurant I was at with my mom when I was in high school, and I'll just reach across the table as if to hold her hand,
Oh, it's beautiful.
right? So I think it's those rituals, and I think it's the normalizing them, the making them part. In Cuba, there's so many rituals, and they're so involved, and I talk about them in the book, and they're beautiful, and they're extensive, but they're all meant to do that same thing, to remind ourselves that the dead are there, um, and they are guiding us, protecting us. And that so is the whole spirit world.
Which a lot of people do not understand and look at askance on. They're missing out on something so beautiful and so helpful in their lives, which I agree with you. I've learned the same thing. So, what is the Rebe tip for finding joy in life? What have you learned is the point of life, and how has this brought you joy?
um, I think that, ironically, I think that the very thing that I spent my whole life running from is the thing that now brings me joy, which is my whole life. And again, this harkens back to what I was saying about my mother being kind of the 1950s quintessential housewife, my own upbringing being like, I got to be perfect. I have to live up to these standards. My whole life, I ran away from the messy parts of life. I wanted to be perfect. I wanted everything I did to be perfect. I wanted my mother to be perfect and that she would have lived forever and would never have had this messy thing happen of dying. One of the things I talk about in the book, one of my greatest regrets is that as my mother was dying, I did not look full on at what was happening. I looked kind of away, and so did the whole family. We pretended it wasn't happening. And I think that's a real disservice because we're all going to die. It's inevitable. Everyone we know and everyone we love is going to die. And there's a beauty, and I might even say a joy in leaning into that rather than looking away. One of the greatest joys I've had are seeing people since my mother passed, where I've been able to sit with them and really be present and look them in the eyes and say the thing I never asked my mother, which was, are you scared? And then the admission on my own part, I'm scared, right? Like that's very real, and that there's a joy in confronting that part of each of us and humanity that yeah, we're vulnerable and we're raw and we're scared and life is messy and a lot of times we don't know where we're going. And how can we lean into that instead of pretending that everything is all right?
That's beautiful, Rebe. I want to add to that from my own experience that I think when you are not afraid anymore of transitioning because you know there's more, you absolutely know you're going to be with your mother again and all of that. I think it makes you more aware of what is the legacy that I'm leaving on this planet before I'm the one to transition, instead of looking at it with such fear and, oh my God, I'm going to die. For me, I now look at it, okay, I'm going to lose this bodysuit, but I'm not dying. And what am I doing with my life until I get there?
I love that, Irene. And in Cuba, it's so baked into Santeria and these other Afro-Cuban spiritual traditions, this idea that because we know that we're going to die, and that we know that we're going to become an ancestor, which is a privileged position.
Right, which is not in fear. It's like it's a blessing.
It's an elevated position because we are then going to be the ones to whisper in the ear of the generations to come. And there's an incredible sense of responsibility with that in Cuba, of the sense of needing to earn that position. So how we live our lives, just
The
like
legacy.
you said, right? The legacy, having that in mind, at the forefront of the mind. What kind of am I training myself to be the kind of ancestor that I would want my
The
children?
wise ancestor. If I'm if I'm saying things to someone, that it's coming from wisdom in a really good place. Rebe, your remarkable journey taught you that our loved ones never leave us, that they are alongside us, guiding and protecting us, whispering in our ear like an inner voice. And your fascinating book, My Mother in Havana, invites everyone who longs to connect with their own lost loved ones to know themselves, not as solitary beings making their way alone in the world, but as a part of a web of ancestors, just like what we're talking about, who accompany us at every step of the way. Thank you from my heart for sharing your incredible journey with its many healing insights on Grief and Rebirth podcast today. I'm very grateful. Thank you. And many blessings.
Oh, thank you so much, Irene, for having me, and blessings to you and to all of your listeners.
Thank you.
Privileged spending time with all of you.
Thank you so much. To be continued, like I like to say.
Thanks for tuning in to Grief and Rebirth. Remember, you can dive deeper into everything we've discussed by checking out the show notes and all past episodes at ireneweinberg.com. Don't forget to follow us on social media at Irene S. Weinberg on Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, and wherever you love to hang out online. Plus, we're on YouTube, so be sure to subscribe and never miss a video. For those of you listening, you'll find links to my 2 books, Good to the Last Drop and They Serve Bagels in Heaven, in the show notes. And if you're watching on YouTube, you can see those books listed right above, so don't miss out. And here comes a special treat. If you sign up for Audible as a first-time user using my link, which you can find in the show notes, you can get They Serve Bagels in Heaven for free. And finally, people often ask me what I read, what I use, and what I recommend for healing and self-care. So I've carefully curated a compilation of those items to share with you. You can head over to kit.co/Grief and Rebirth to check them out. Thanks again for tuning in, and until next time, many blessings.